Have you ever felt like you're working incredibly hard, running at absolute full speed, but you know, somehow you're just spinning your wheels?
Yeah, that's a very real feeling for a lot of people.
Right. Because you have the passion, you have the drive, your intent is completely pure, but the results just, well, they aren't matching the effort.
Exactly. And you look around and think, I'm exhausted, everyone around me is exhausted, but we aren't actually moving forward.
Yes, exactly. And if you, the listener, are nodding your head right now, whether you lead a massive organization or you volunteer at a local charity, or maybe you're just trying to manage the absolute chaos of your own family's schedule, you are intimately familiar with this gap.
Oh, absolutely. The gap between good intentions and actual tangible traction.
It is a deeply frustrating place to exist.
It really is. And the trap there, I think, is assuming that the exhaustion is somehow proof of your dedication.
Wait, say more about that.
Well, we often confuse the friction of spinning our wheels with the friction of actually gaining ground. We think, I'm tired, so I must be doing something right.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that hits close to home.
Right. But what we're really dealing with isn't a lack of sincerity. It's a profound lack of clarity.
Which brings us perfectly to the topic at hand. Welcome to today's deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a fascinating framework known as the missions mapping process.
It's a brilliant system.
It really is. It's designed to help organizations, specifically looking at churches, ministries, and mission agencies, transition out of that chaotic noise of good intentions and step into the clarity of faithful action.
Moving from raw data to deep spiritual discernment.
Yes. But before we get into the weeds, let's address the tension in the room right away.
Yeah, we probably should. Because when people operating in a spiritual or, humanitarian space hear words like data, mapping, or metrics,
Walls go up immediately.
immediately people get super defensive. There's this fear that we're trying to import cold, ruthless corporate management tactics into a sacred space.
Right, like turning a church into a Fortune 500 company.
Exactly. But the framework we are exploring today completely flips that narrative. It argues that treating attention as a holy act is the farthest thing from corporate coldness.
Treating attention as a holy act. I really, really love that phrase.
It changes everything. Because God's work deserves far more than our sincere, chaotic impulses, right? It demands our careful, attentive stewardship.
Okay, let's unpack this, because one of the hardest truths we have to swallow is that most ministries, or passion projects in general, they don't fail because people don't care enough.
No, they fail because passion is not the same thing as a map.
Exactly. You can have the most passionate crew in the world, but if they don't know where the rocks are,
They're going to sink the ship.
every single time.
Because passion provides the energy. It does not provide the coordinates. A leadership team can spend hours in incredibly sincere prayer. They can recruit devoted volunteers. They can harbor a genuine desire to serve their neighborhood.
But they can still find themselves making foundational decisions completely in the dark.
Yeah.
Think about it like trying to navigate a sprawling, unfamiliar city. You're behind the wheel, you have a full tank of gas, a fast car, and tons of enthusiasm to reach your destination.
But you don't have a GPS.
Right. You don't have a map, you don't even have street signs. You might be driving fast and the engine sounds great, but you are still incredibly lost.
And honestly, your speed is just getting you lost much quicker.
Yeah, exactly.
And that speed, that frantic energy, it actually creates a phenomenon the source material calls the holy fog.
The holy fog, that is such a perceptive concept.
It really is. It occurs when human beings, especially those driven by deep compassion, see just enough of a situation to become fiercely passionate, but not nearly enough to be precise.
So we end up operating from just like fragments of reality.
Yep. Yes. Mistaking a single pixel for the entire picture.
How does that actually manifest, though? Like when you're dealing with real people in a real community? Because I imagine cognitive bias plays a massive role here.
Oh, cognitive bias is the engine of the holy fog. It manifests through what psychologists call the availability heuristic.
Meaning we rely on whatever immediate examples pop into our heads.
Exactly. So, in a ministry setting, this looks like hearing one incredibly moving testimony from a single neighbor who, say, just lost their job.
And then immediately assuming unemployment is the defining crisis for the whole neighborhood.
Right. Or a leadership team notices one youth program thriving, and they subconsciously assume the entire organization has incredible momentum.
Completely blind to the fact that, I don't know, adult education is collapsing right down the hall.
Exactly. We feel the extreme urgency of a localized need, and we mistakenly believe that feeling that urgency is the same thing as understanding the root cause.
We assume urgency equals understanding.
Yes, and that is a dangerous assumption.
If you're listening to this right now, think about how often you make decisions in your own life based entirely on panic or urgency. You feel the heat, so you act on impulse.
You throw money at a problem, or you create a new rule.
Or you launch a new initiative just to alleviate the anxiety of doing nothing.
Yeah, but operating on impulse isn't leadership, and it
Yeah.
certainly isn't stewardship.
Right.
Yeah.
And Christian leadership, historically and biblically, has never been a call to guesswork.
No, not at all. I mean, a steward is someone tasked with managing a master's property. You can't manage a field if you refuse to test the soil.
Oh, that's good.
What's absolutely fascinating about the biblical worldview is that it fundamentally isn't anti-data. It's anti-delusion. It demands an honest confrontation with reality.
Because faith does not fear reality.
Exactly. Faith depends on truth. Look at the historical narratives in the text. Consider Moses leading a fractured, overwhelmed group of people.
He didn't just pray harder when the system broke down.
No. His father-in-law, Jethro, observed the actual daily mechanics of Moses' leadership. He watched people stand in line from morning until evening, waiting for a dispute to be settled.
And Jethro basically presented a data-driven organizational critique.
He did. He said, "What you are doing is not good. You and these people will wear yourselves out." Moses had to see the structural flaw before he could appoint new leaders.
And Nehemiah is another brilliant example of this.
Oh, definitely.
Before he ever announced a massive public rebuilding campaign to repair the walls of Jerusalem, he did a physical audit. He rode his horse out in the middle of the night, in the dark, silently inspecting the ruined gates and the broken masonry.
He had to measure the actual physical devastation before he could rally the spiritual enthusiasm of the people.
Even Jesus operated this way, didn't he?
He did. Think about before he fed the multitude. He didn't just wave his hand and ignore the physical constraints of the moment. He turned to the disciples and asked a diagnostic question.
How many loaves do you have? Go and see.
Right. And he didn't ask because he lacked divine power or, omniscience. He forced the disciples to take an inventory.
To name what was actually present.
Yes. They had to confront the reality of their severe limitation, just 5 loaves and 2 fish, before the miracle could even take place.
That completely reframes how we should view assessment. Confronting reality, doing the math, taking the inventory. These aren't secular distractions from faith.
They're the prerequisites for it.
But that brings us to the actual mechanics. How do we clear the fog? If we need a map, we have to gather the topographical data.
We do.
But gathering data in a church or a nonprofit, it feels so clinical. When I hear the word data in this context, my brain immediately conjures up those terrible, glossy customer satisfaction cards they leave in hotel rooms.
Yeah, that aversion is entirely natural. Because frankly, we've all been subjected to poorly executed data collection.
Right.
But a poorly designed instrument doesn't invalidate the need for measurement. To build this map, we need instruments of truth. We need structured ways to listen. And the first foundational instrument is the survey.
Okay, but aren't surveys inherently a bit cold? Like, you're reducing a human being's spiritual journey to a multiple choice question or a scale from 1 to 5.
Yeah.
How do you possibly make a digital form feel pastoral?
You make it pastoral by understanding its true purpose.
Yeah.
A survey is not a customer service metric. It's an instrument of listening at scale.
Listening at scale.
Yeah, because when you're dealing with a group larger than, say, 20 people, you physically cannot sit down with everyone every week. And what happens in any organization is the loudest voices end up dominating the feedback loop.
The squeaky wheel gets the grease, and the silent majority just slowly disengages.
Exactly the problem.
Yeah.
A well-crafted anonymous survey bypasses those loudest voices. It creates a safe, quiet space for the introverted newcomer who would never dream of raising their hand in a town hall meeting.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
It allows the exhausted, burned-out volunteer to tell the truth without fear of disappointing their pastor face-to-face. Asking simple, direct moral questions through a survey is actually an act of profound humility from a leadership team.
It's the leaders structurally confessing we are limited, we don't see everything.
Right. We need the body to show us what we are missing.
Let me guess how this plays out in real life. A church leadership team probably thinks they have a great culture, the music is good, people smile at the door, but the survey comes back and shatters their illusion.
That is almost always the dynamic. Let's look at a specific scenario from the material that illustrates this perfectly. Imagine a congregation that prides itself on being a remarkably warm church.
Okay.
For years, the reigning narrative among the core members is, "We are so friendly." And to be fair, visitors at the door frequently compliment the greeters.
But I'm guessing the numbers say otherwise.
Right. The leadership looks at their baseline metrics and realizes membership growth has been completely flat for half a decade. New people show up once or twice, receive a firm handshake and a smile, and then vanish without a trace.
The natural assumption for a leadership team in that spot is to blame the culture, isn't it? They probably sit in a boardroom and say, people today are just non-committal, the culture is apathetic.
That is the ultimate defensive posture, and it's exactly what this church assumed. So they doubled down on their current strategy. They printed glossier flyers, hosted more high-energy outreach events.
And nothing changed.
Nothing changed. The fog was thick. Finally, they swallowed their pride and deployed a highly specific, anonymous survey targeted only at people who had visited in the last 6 months.
And the results broke the narrative.
A massive reality check. The newcomers responded and said, "Yes, your greeters are lovely. We felt acknowledged at the door. But the moment we walked into the sanctuary, we had absolutely no idea what to do next."
Oh, wow.
They noted that the Sunday announcements were packed with insider acronyms that no one explained. Parents loved the physical look of the nursery, but they couldn't find a single printed policy on child safety protocols, which terrified them.
So they felt admired from a distance, but they were essentially locked out of the actual life of the community.
The revelation was paradigm shifting. The church was not unkind. The church was deeply, structurally unclear.
Unkind versus unclear. Man, if you are leading anything, write that down. You might be the nicest person in the world, but if your systems are opaque, people experience that opacity as rejection.
They really do.
They don't think, oh, they just have bad signage. They think, I do not belong here.
And you only discover that distinction by asking at scale. But a survey has a hard limit. A survey provides a spreadsheet of symptoms. It tells you how many people feel disconnected. It tells you that 40% of your volunteers quit last year. It provides the statistics.
Right, but a statistic cannot tell you why they quit. If 40% of volunteers walk out the door, the survey flags the hemorrhage, but it doesn't give you the diagnosis.
Exactly.
Did they leave because of a scheduling conflict? Did they leave because of a toxic conflict with a staff member? Or did they leave because the expectations were never defined and they felt like they were failing?
To find the why, you have to move to the second instrument.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Interviews. Statistics tell you what happened. Stories tell you why it happened. Numbers simply cannot carry the weight of a complex human life.
So an interview isn't just an exit survey done verbally. It requires a completely different posture.
It requires a posture of intense, curious empathy. Think about Jesus as the master of the diagnostic question. When he encounters Bartimaeus, the blind beggar, on the road to Jericho, Jesus stops the entire chaotic procession of the crowd.
Yeah.
He calls the man over and asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?"
Which, from the outside, looks like an absurd question. The man is blind. He's begging. It is painfully obvious to everyone what he needs.
But Jesus wasn't asking to gather information for himself. He wasn't confused about the man's physical ailment. He asked the question to give Bartimaeus the dignity of articulating his own desire.
Oh, that's powerful.
He took a man who was treated as a societal nuisance and gave him a voice and agency. A good interview in a ministry context is not an interrogation to figure out how to optimize a volunteer.
It's a pastoral act.
Exactly. It looks the person in the eye and communicates, "You're not a metric on our quarterly report. Your specific experience in this community matters to God and to us."
Let's ground this. Paint a picture of what happens when a leadership team actually sits down and listens to the stories behind the statistics.
Okay, imagine a thriving young adult ministry. On paper, the metrics are phenomenal. Weekly attendance is consistently high, the Instagram engagement is off the charts, and the general vibe is incredibly energetic.
Sounds like a success.
Right. But the pastors running it have this nagging pastoral intuition that the roots are shallow. People are showing up to the events, but very few are stepping into long-term discipleship or serving elsewhere in the church.
The spreadsheet says they're winning, but the gut says they are stalling.
So instead of setting another survey, the leaders select 20 young adults across different levels of engagement and take them out for coffee, one-on-one. They just ask open-ended questions about their spiritual lives.
And what happens?
The stories they hear completely dismantle their assumptions. One young professional admits that she loves the intellectual depth of the teaching, but she feels completely paralyzed by shame
Why shame?
because she doesn't know how to find the book of Galatians in her Bible. And the culture of the group projects such a high level of spiritual advancement that she is terrified to ask a basic question.
Oh, wow. That's a huge gap between perception and reality.
Another regular attendee reveals that he is navigating a devastating hidden grief, the loss of a sibling, and the relentless, high-energy, celebratory atmosphere of the ministry provides absolutely no space for him to lament or process his pain. He attends, but he feels like a ghost.
And none of that nuance, none of that human ache is ever going to show up on a multiple choice survey?
And never. The ministry hadn't failed because it lacked sincerity or production value. It was failing to notice the human story beneath the attendance statistic.
But once they possessed those stories,
They had the map. They could structurally pivot. They created smaller, highly vulnerable groups specifically for asking foundational questions without judgment. They designed quiet, contemplative spaces for those processing grief. The interviews didn't just gather data. They opened a pathway to actual healing.
that is incredible. Okay, so we have surveys for the wide net, we have interviews for the deep dive, but now we arrive at the third instrument, and this is where the tension really ratchets up. Because now we have to look at the things that don't talk, but speak volumes.
Budget analysis.
This is often the most uncomfortable stage, isn't it?
It is deeply uncomfortable because we are forced to treat the budget not as a mathematical necessity, but as a deeply theological document.
A theological document. Calling an Excel spreadsheet a theological document is a heavy provocation, but it makes perfect sense. I view a budget essentially as a lie detector test for an organization's actual priorities.
That's a great analogy.
You can have the most beautifully crafted, poetically inspiring mission statement printed on the wall of your lobby, but your ledger reveals your actual loves.
The ledger does not lie. The ledger exposes the true shape of your mission. When Jesus said, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also," he was not offering a gentle, poetic proverb about feelings.
No, he was providing a devastatingly accurate spiritual diagnostic tool.
Exactly. Money is never just currency. It is crystallized energy and time. What we fund is what we actually cherish, what we protect, and what we believe is vital for the future.
So when a leadership team sits down with the budget, what are they actually looking for?
They are looking to diagnose the underlying organizational mindset. The fundamental question is this organization operating in survival mode or kingdom stewardship?
Break those two down for us. What's the difference?
Survival mode is an entirely defensive posture. The budget is constructed almost exclusively around protecting the familiar and keeping the institution on life support for another fiscal year.
So maintaining the status quo.
Right? The vast majority of resources go toward maintaining aging infrastructure, servicing debt, and funding legacy programs that keep the heaviest donors comfortable.
And kingdom stewardship.
Kingdom stewardship asks a radically different question. What resources has God entrusted to us in this specific season, and how can they be deployed to take new ground and advance the mission? In survival mode, money is the master dictating what cannot be done. In kingdom stewardship, money is the servant of the vision.
Let's use the lie detector test on a hypothetical church. A pastor stands up on Sunday morning, looks at the congregation, and preaches a passionate sermon about how the absolute non-negotiable priority of the church is reaching young families and equipping the next generation.
The rhetoric is beautiful,
Mm.
but then you pull the financial reports for the last 3 years.
And the lie detector goes off. The ledger reveals that 75% of the discretionary budget is locked into massive, continuous upgrades for the main sanctuary. New lighting, better sound systems, carpet replacement.
Yeah.
Another large chunk is dedicated to a legacy adult program that hasn't grown in a decade. Meanwhile, the children's ministry is operating on absolute pennies. The volunteers are literally buying crayons with their own money, and there's zero budget allocated for parenting seminars.
The stated value is the next generation. The rewarded funded value is adult comfort. And here's the most crucial, compassionate point we have to make about this dynamic.
What's that?
This contradiction is almost never born out of malice.
Right. There isn't some shadowy cabal of elders sitting in a smoke-filled back room actively plotting to starve the children's ministry.
Exactly the opposite. It happens through the silent, invisible force of institutional drift.
Institutional drift.
Yeah. It happens because the easiest thing to do in a finance meeting is to take last year's budget, copy it, paste it into this year's spreadsheet, and maybe adjust everything up by 2% for inflation.
Wow, yeah. That is so common.
Over 5 or 10 years, the budget becomes a fossilized record of accumulated habits rather than a living reflection of intentional convictions. Analyzing the budget disrupts that drift. It forces the leadership to look at the numbers and say, we must align our spending with our speaking.
Which brings us directly to the pain of the fourth instrument of truth: program review. This is the audit of your calendar. It's examining everything that currently exists before you succumb to the temptation to create something new.
We have this ingrained illusion in ministry and nonprofit work that adding more activity is synonymous with caring more deeply.
Oh, totally. When a new need arises in the community, our default reflex is to launch a new program.
Form a new committee or host a new event.
And over a decade, your organization turns into a hoarder's house.
That's exactly what it looks like.
The church becomes a crowded, dense forest of well-intentioned, entirely disconnected activities. There's a men's breakfast, a knitting circle, a Tuesday theology pub, a Thursday food pantry, 3 different youth retreats, and suddenly, no one can see the actual path of discipleship anymore. It's just noise.
It is exhausting noise, but executing a program review is phenomenally difficult because you aren't just looking at schedules, you are dealing with profound emotional attachment.
I've seen this. Why is it so incredibly hard for groups to just kill off an old program? A program can be clearly, undeniably dead in the water. It hasn't produced fruit in years. The volunteers running it are miserable. And yet, if a leader suggests shutting it down, people will fight tooth and nail just to keep it on the calendar.
To understand that resistance, you have to look through a psychological and pastoral lens, not just a strategic one. People do not attach themselves to programs. They attach themselves to the memories of who they were when that program was thriving.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Think about a Wednesday night Bible study that has dwindled to 4 people. To the strategic leader, it is a waste of a room and heating costs. But to the 70-year-old woman fiercely defending it, that room is where she first understood the grace of God 30 years ago. It is where her friends, who have since passed away, used to sit.
So asking her to let go of the program feels like you're asking her to erase her own spiritual history.
Exactly. It's preemptive grief. And leaders must shepherd people through that grief. However, honoring the past does not mean sacrificing the future to it. The kingdom of God is not advanced by doing everything at once.
We have to have the theological reverence to look at a beloved program and say, this was an incredibly useful vessel in a previous season, but it is no longer central to the mission he has for us today.
We have to understand that some ministries are meant to be bridges for a specific season, not permanent monuments to be maintained forever.
Bridges, not monuments. If you are listening, think about your own life or your own business. What are you currently maintaining as a monument that was only ever supposed to be a bridge to get you through a specific season? The maintenance of monuments will bankrupt your energy.
Imagine a church that finally decides to stop maintaining its monuments. They look at their massive, sprawling, exhausting calendar. They look at the burnout rate of their volunteers, who are running themselves ragged trying to staff 20 mediocre events.
And they make the hard calls.
They sit down with legacy groups, they celebrate the history, they grieve the endings, and they consolidate. They prune the dead branches, they redirect all that scattered, frantic energy into 3 core, deeply fruitful ministries.
And the immediate result is that people can finally breathe. The volunteers get their joy back because they are doing one thing excellently instead of 5 things poorly. The church becomes less busy, but infinitely more impactful.
We've now looked intimately at the internal life of the organization through surveys, interviews, budgets, and programs. But if we stop there, we have only mapped the ship. We haven't mapped the ocean.
That brings us to the 5th instrument.
The 5th instrument forces us to look outside our own walls: community observation.
This is where we deal with the reality that an organization can be incredibly internally busy, yet functionally blind to the physical neighborhood it inhabits. You can know exactly when the choir rehearses, but have absolutely no idea what the single mother living 50 feet from your doors actually struggles with.
The term used for this practice in the text is incarnational attention.
Unpack that for me. What does incarnational attention practically mean?
Theologically, the incarnation is the reality of God becoming flesh, entering human history not as a concept, but as a person in a specific, dusty, politically volatile place and time. Incarnational attention means looking at the real, physical, specific world around you the way Jesus did. When Jesus walked through a crowd, he didn't see an abstract demographic. He noticed when people were harassed. He noticed when they were helpless. He noticed the widow putting 2 small coins into the offering.
So the church is not an export business.
No, it's not manufacturing pre-packaged religious goods inside a warehouse and shipping them to generic consumers. It's an organism that must intimately understand the actual chemical composition of the soil it is planted in.
It's the difference between broadcasting on a generic frequency and actually tuning into the receiver. I know of a perfect scenario that highlights the cost of ignoring this. There was a church that had occupied a massive corner lot in a neighborhood for 40 years. They had rock-solid preaching, highly organized internal programs, a great band, but absolutely zero new people from the immediate neighborhood ever walked through the doors.
And the internal narrative the leaders spun to explain this was likely entirely defensive.
Oh, completely. They sat in their staff meetings and concluded that the neighborhood was just hard soil. They assumed the culture was fiercely secular, resistant to the gospel, and that people simply didn't care about spiritual things anymore.
But then they actually decided to do the work of observation. They didn't just look at census data, they walked the streets. They talked to the baristas, the school teachers, the shift managers at the local factories. They paid incarnational attention.
And the reality they discovered was staggering. The neighborhood wasn't philosophically resistant to the gospel at all. It was simply fragmented by entirely different daily economic rhythms.
Of course.
The area was heavily populated by hospital shift workers, retail employees, and industrial workers who were physically exhausted or actually on the clock during the sacred Sunday morning at 10 a.m. hour. Additionally, there were massive apartment complexes filled with lower-income families who didn't own reliable vehicles, and the public transit didn't run effectively on Sunday mornings.
So the barrier wasn't spiritual apathy, it was basic accessibility.
Exactly. They didn't need a more persuasive sermon. They didn't need a glossier mailer. They needed a different meeting time. They needed a service on a Tuesday night. They needed to organize carpools from the apartment complexes.
Once they saw the actual reality of their neighbors' lives, they could adapt their structure to serve them.
Yeah.
Community observation is not just secular sociology masquerading as ministry. It is the deep spiritual practice of truly seeing your neighbor.
Okay, so if you are a leader and you have actually done the hard work of these 5 instruments, you've surveyed the body, you've interviewed the marginalized, you've interrogated the budget, you've pruned the calendar, and you've exegeted the neighborhood, you're going to end up with a terrifyingly large mountain of data.
A literal mountain.
You have a table covered in spreadsheets, transcripts, and financial ledgers. But data sitting on a table does not interpret itself.
Data is inert. It requires diagnosis. This is the pivot from collecting information to making sense of the noise. We have to run all of this raw data through specific diagnostic categories. And the crucial, non-negotiable first category we must look for is strengths.
Now I have to challenge this instinct. If I am a leader looking at a massive pile of organizational data, my immediate psychological impulse is to hunt for the fires. I want to find the broken systems, the leaking money, the unhappy volunteers, and fix them. Why on earth would we spend time patting ourselves on the back for what is already working?
Because if you give in to that impulse, you will inevitably succumb to deficit thinking. And deficit thinking is toxic to organizational culture.
How so?
If every leadership meeting is exclusively a hunt for what is broken, you inadvertently create a culture dominated by scarcity, anxiety, and fear. Your volunteers will begin to feel like they are never enough. Your staff will become deeply defensive, hiding their mistakes because failure is the only thing that gets attention. You train your organization to believe it is inherently flawed.
Wow. It becomes incredibly depressing. You just bleed morale.
You do, but beyond morale, deficit thinking is fundamentally unbiblical. Look at the letters of the Apostle Paul. He was frequently writing to churches that were complete disasters. The church in Corinth was fracturing over lawsuits, sexual immorality, and chaotic worship services. Yet, Paul almost universally begins his letters by naming the grace that is already present. He thanks God for their spiritual gifts before he ever brings the hammer of correction.
He identifies what is bearing fruit before he prunes the disease.
Precisely. A strength is not just a corporate competency. In a ministry context, a strength is tangible evidence of God's grace already actively at work among you. If you don't deliberately map your strengths, you might accidentally construct a strategic plan that ignores the very weapons and gifts God has already placed in your hands.
Consider a church that is absolutely obsessed with its lack of youth. The leaders spend all their energy agonizing over the fact that they have no teenagers. They're researching youth ministry trends, trying to hire young hip pastors, beating themselves up over their demographic deficit. Meanwhile, they are completely blind to a massive hidden strength sitting right in the pews.
The strength of their elders.
Yes. They have a congregation full of 60 and 70-year-olds who have lived in the community for decades. They possess unimaginable relational capital. They know the mayors, the school principals, the business owners, and they have a deep, quiet, fierce culture of intercessory prayer.
But they miss it.
Because the leadership is so fixated on the deficit of youth, they are completely ignoring the massive asset of wisdom and relational trust. Once you map the strength, you stop trying to be a youth-driven church, and you start leaning into being a mentorship-driven church.
Strategy should never replace what is already bearing fruit. It should amplify it. But as you pointed out, we cannot ignore the fires forever. We must diagnose the problems. This brings us to the second category, weaknesses.
Okay.
But we must define weakness very carefully. We must view them as limitations without shame.
Limitations without shame. That implies that the natural human reaction to a weakness is to hide it.
We hide weakness because we feel shame. And shame is the enemy of truth. Shame whispers to a leader, if you are weak in this area, you are an imposter, you are disqualified.
Yep.
It forces leaders to expend massive amounts of energy maintaining a facade of absolute perfection.
Right.
But weaknesses are not inherently moral failures.
Yeah.
We have to categorize them objectively. Sometimes a weakness is just a profound skill gap. You have a worship leader with a great heart who simply does not know how to arrange music for a band.
Or it's a process gap. You have incredibly friendly people, but your software for tracking visitors is from 1998, so every newcomer falls through the cracks.
Yeah.
It's not a lack of love, it's a lack of infrastructure.
Or it is simply leader overload. Your best, most dedicated volunteers are not lazy. They are just completely dangerously exhausted because they are carrying the weight of 3 different ministries.
Yeah, that happens all the time.
The gospel radically refuses the logic of shame. The Apostle Paul didn't just admit his weaknesses, he actively boasted in them, declaring that God's power is perfected in human frailty. When a leadership team can sit in a room and say, without an ounce of shame, we are completely failing at guest follow-up or our administrative systems are broken, that is not a failure of faith. It is an act of truth. And truth is the only soil where healing can grow.
So a weakness is a system that exists but is failing, which leads us to the third diagnostic category, which sounds similar but is fundamentally different. Gaps. Gaps are the invisible losses.
Yes, the distinction is vital. A weakness means the bridge is built, but the wood is rotting and needs repair. A gap means the bridge simply does not exist. It is the void between your stated intent and your actual implementation.
Let's use that bridge analogy. Imagine a raging river. On one side, you have a beautifully paved road representing a new believer's desire to grow. On the other side, you have a fantastic, well-lit road representing deep, mature discipleship. You have all the pastoral intent in the world for people to cross from one side to the other.
But nobody actually built a bridge over the water.
Exactly. There is no specific class, no mentorship program, no pathway, so people walk to the edge of the water, look across, and then just quietly fall in and get swept away.
The tragedy of a gap is its silence. A rotting bridge. A weakness usually causes a loud, visible crisis. Someone falls through, everyone complains, and it gets fixed. But a gap produces invisible casualties.
Because there's nothing to fall through, you just disappear.
Right. People don't usually cause a massive scandal when they encounter a gap. They just quietly fade out the back door of the church. Maybe there is a massive gap in how you minister to newly divorced individuals, or a gap in caring for the caregivers of aging parents.
And the theological mandate here is heavy. The Christian narrative is fundamentally about God stepping into the ultimate uncrossable gap between humanity and himself.
Exactly. If the incarnation and the cross are about God crossing the void to reach the isolated, then the church, more than any institution on earth, must be intensely gap-aware. Look at the narrative in Acts chapter 6.
Oh, that's a great example.
The early church was exploding with growth, but a massive gap opened up. The Greek-speaking widows were being entirely overlooked in the daily distribution of food. The cultural majority was being fed. The minority was starving.
And what I love about that story is that the apostles didn't just hold a prayer meeting about it and over-spiritualize the starvation.
No, they took immediate structural action. They didn't view the gap as a threat to their authority. They viewed it as an invitation to organize. They appointed 7 new leaders specifically to stand in that gap and ensure the vulnerable were fed. Recognizing a gap demands obedient, structural action.
Okay, so we've covered strengths, weaknesses, and gaps. The fourth category in the data is redundancies, repetition without purpose.
We have to draw a sharp line here between strategic redundancy and wasteful duplication. Strategic redundancy is incredibly healthy. It is reinforcement. If you only have one person in the entire church who knows how to run the soundboard, you don't have a ministry. You have a hostage situation. Training 3 people to do it is strategic redundancy. Repeating your core theological values in the sermon, the youth group, and the small group curriculum is strategic redundancy.
So what is wasteful duplication? How does the clutter actually grow?
Wasteful duplication grows through ministry silos and territorialism. It happens when leaders stop communicating. A classic example is a church that has 4 completely uncoordinated neighborhood outreach initiatives running simultaneously.
Okay, lay it out.
The youth group decides to do a Saturday park cleanup. The men's ministry decides to do a food drive for the same neighborhood. The women's ministry launches an after-school tutoring program, and the missions committee plans a seasonal block party.
All hitting the exact same 5-block radius.
All hitting the same area, all drawing from the exact same limited pool of church volunteers, and all asking the same congregation for donations. Everyone is exhausted, the church's resources are fractured, and frankly, the neighborhood is just confused by these 4 disjointed efforts.
The diagnosis forces them to look at the map and realize they are competing with themselves. So they merge them. They take the youth, the men, the women, and the missions team, and they create one massive, coherent, deeply resourced pathway for neighborhood renewal. They prune the redundancy to produce actual concentrated fruit.
Which brings us to the 5th and arguably the most dangerous diagnostic category. Misalignments.
Misalignment. I want to use a medical analogy here because it feels fitting. Misalignment in an organization is like an autoimmune disease. In an autoimmune disease, the body's internal communication system breaks down. The defense mechanisms, which are inherently good and designed to protect the body, get confused and start actively attacking the body's own healthy cells. The body is literally at war with itself.
That is a terrifyingly accurate metaphor for organizational misalignment. It is the presence of inherently good things pulling fiercely in opposite directions, tearing the organization apart from the inside.
Like rowing a boat with maximum effort but zero movement because everyone is rowing in a different direction.
Yes, it is the deep fracture between an organization's mission statement and its ministry soul.
The mission statement versus the ministry soul. Elaborate on that tension.
Your mission statement is what you boldly proclaim on your website. Your ministry soul is the sum total of what your systems actually tolerate, fund, and reward.
Let's apply the autoimmune metaphor to a real church scenario.
Okay, a church's stated mission, and the pastor preaches every Sunday, is that they value deep, slow, relational discipleship. They tell the congregation, we want you to walk intimately with Jesus and bear one another's burdens. That is the mission statement.
Sounds great.
But the ministry soul, the actual machinery of the organization, only rewards scale and speed. The leadership publicly praises the small group leaders who double their group size in a month. They only allocate budget to the ministries that draw massive crowds. They subtly penalize or ignore the pastor who spends 15 hours a week doing slow, invisible counseling with 3 severely depressed individuals because those hours don't produce a metric that looks good on a quarterly report.
The body is at war with itself. The pulpit is demanding depth, but the organizational structure is exclusively rewarding width. And the tragedy is, human beings are incredibly intuitive. We are not stupid. Your congregation will always, eventually, conform to what the system actually rewards, no matter how eloquently you preach about the stated mission.
Always. If you say you value young families, but you schedule mandatory volunteer training at 6:08 p.m. on a Tuesday when parents are frantically trying to feed toddlers and do bath time, you are misaligned.
You are asking them to choose between their family and their church.
Yes. Misalignment drains trust faster than almost any other organizational failure. It creates a deep, exhausting internal cognitive dissonance.
Okay, let's take a breath. We have done the work. We collected the data through surveys, interviews, budgets, programs, and observation. We have diagnosed that mountain of data. We know our strengths, our weaknesses, our gaps, our redundancies, and our misalignment. The map is drawn. The topography is clear. Is it finally time to execute? Do we draft the 3-year strategic plan now?
Not yet. If we jump to strategy now, we have missed the entire point. We are missing the ultimate final lens.
So what does this all mean? This is the pivot point. We move to the final stage. theological reflection.
This is where the process radically diverges from a secular corporate consultation. We must subject every piece of data, every strength, and every gap to the judgment of the Word of God. We must remember with absolute conviction that data is a useful servant, but a tyrannical master.
Because data only tells us the what. It takes theology to tell us the meaning.
If we allow what can be counted on a spreadsheet to become the final arbiter of truth, we will inevitably build a corporate empire instead of a kingdom outpost. We cannot evaluate the spiritual harvest using the metrics of Wall Street.
No, we can't.
Jesus did not look at the massive crowds following him and calculate demographic market share or donor retention rates. He looked at the crowds and had deep compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He evaluated reality through the lens of divine love, not corporate efficiency.
The framework calls this looking through a cruciform lens, reading the reality of your organization through the reality of the cross.
The cruciform lens upends every metric of human success. The world, and tragically much of the modern church, looks at a small congregation, a lack of cultural influence, a tiny budget, or a season of visible weakness, and automatically assumes God's blessing has departed. They assume failure.
Because in a corporate mindset, small equals bad, and suffering equals failure.
But look at the cross. At the crucifixion, the disciples, the Romans, the religious elite, everyone looking at that event saw absolute defeat. They saw humiliation, the collapse of a movement, the ultimate failure.
But that wasn't the whole story.
Not at all. Through the cruciform lens, that moment of agonizing weakness was actually the greatest, most decisive victory in the history of the cosmos. When we assess our ministries, we cannot simply ask, are we efficient or are we growing? We have to ask the much harder question, are we faithful?
Consider the book of Revelation. When the resurrected Christ addresses the 7 churches in Asia Minor, his performance review looks nothing like a modern strategic assessment.
It is entirely different. He doesn't judge the church in Smyrna by their lack of budget or their marginalization in the city. He commends their spiritual wealth and endurance under terrifying pressure.
And then there's Laodicea.
Right. He looks at the church in Laodicea, which was wealthy, comfortable, expanding, and entirely self-sufficient. A church that would be on the cover of modern ministry magazines, and he tells them they are spiritually bankrupt, naked, and blind. The cross changes the math entirely.
Which brings us to the profound theological relief at the center of this entire process. We do all this mapping, all this hard work, not to prove our worth to God, but to participate in what he is already doing.
Mission as participation.
Mm.
It is the realization that mission is not our performance for God. It is our participation in God's ongoing, relentless pursuit of the world.
If you really internalize that, it takes a crushing weight off your shoulders.
It removes the devastating anxiety that so many leaders carry, the secret belief that if they don't craft the perfect, flawless strategic plan, the church will fail and people won't be saved. God is already at work reconciling the world to himself.
The Holy Spirit is already moving in your neighborhood.
Exactly. The purpose of mapping your church is not to invent a mission from scratch. It is to discern where the Spirit is already moving and structurally align your community to join him there. We observe carefully, interpret faithfully, pray earnestly, and act obediently.
We've covered a massive organizational framework today. We've talked to institutional drift, surveys, data, and systemic gaps. But as we land the plane, I want to bring this directly to you, the listener. Because these principles do not just apply to megachurches, international nonprofits, or complex organizations. They apply to the architecture of a single human life.
They really do.
Think about your own personal missions map. Take a hard look at your internal landscape. Where are the gaps in your own spiritual life? Do you possess a massive library of theological knowledge, a deep understanding of Scripture, but a glaring, silent gap when it comes to actual obedience or loving your neighbor?
That's a challenging question.
And where is the holy fog operating in your personal schedule? Are you running at 100 miles an hour, addicted to the adrenaline of urgency, mistaking a packed calendar for a purposeful life, while entirely lacking clarity on what God actually wants you to do today?
That hits hard for a lot of people.
And what about the budget lie detector? If we were to audit your personal bank statements for the last 3 months, would those ledgers reflect the values you claim to hold dear? Or would they reveal a hidden autoimmune misalignment where your money is funding your comfort at the expense of your calling?
Those are terrifying, but necessary questions. And the final thought to dwell on is this. True alignment, whether we are talking about a multinational ministry or the quiet habits of a single human heart, is not merely about achieving peak efficiency. Alignment is a form of worship.
A form of worship.
Yes. When you possess the courage to present your actual schedule, your real budget, your hidden redundancies, and your deepest weaknesses to God honestly, without the shield of shame, that is a profound act of devotion. If Jesus is truly Lord, then no spreadsheet, no cultural metric of success, and no amount of institutional applause can overrule his evaluation of your life.
We have to stop driving 90 miles an hour in the fog. We have to have the courage to pull over, take a step back, look at the actual unvarnished evidence of our lives, our schedules, and our resources, and ask the most terrifying, liberating question possible. Lord, what do you say about what I see?
It's the only way forward.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.